Go Mal!
So have you ever had a long, heartfelt conversation with your boss about how to make the business better and more fair? Can you imagine if that's the norm and there are no bosses? How do we make businesses more productive, pleasant, secure, and sustainable? If you're skeptical of the corporate form, so were the founding fathers. They limited the size of corporations and how long they could last. Mother Jones, a labor organizer in the 1800s, asked, can we have democracy in society if we have a monarchy in the workplace? As a young student, I looked at state socialism and I thought that was an even greater threat to dignity and democracy. So after college, I decided to explore another economic model, workplace democracy. Worked on a large cooperative farm in Israel called the kibbutz, 600 people. And after I got used to getting up at 4 in the morning and learning how much I didn't know about farm work, they accepted me. Hard work was respected. There was gender equity. Seniors would work a few hours a day, whatever they could, and they were fully part of the community. All of the decisions were made by the workers. You'd vote for whoever was going to be the leader, and the leader would rotate every year. So they never would abuse their position because the next year you could be the leader. This created high morale, great productivity. People were careful about the environment. I was impressed enough to consider looking in Spain at the Basque country at Mondragon, which is a Commonwealth cooperative set up by a reforming priest, Arizmendi, in the 1930s. A very poor region moved to prosperity through cooperatives. He set up a technical college, and as his students finished and opened their businesses, they kept everything democratic. They worked together, they shared resources, and soon they opened up credit unions, insurance companies, schools, a series of supermarkets. Today, they're the 10th biggest business in Spain. Workers are careful about the environment, and they really don't need a government to tell them to take care of their environment. Similarly, in India, in the poor state of Kerala, near the coast, they moved from poverty to prosperity because of a series of cooperatives. In this case, it was the government that came in with the plan, Kundumbashri, that allowed women, if they wanted, to voluntarily form cooperatives in farms or in factories. And 4.5 million women went from poverty to security because of the programs. When they interviewed the women on what the effects were, they talked about changes on the home front. There was more respect in the family because they were bringing in money. There was more security. They learned how to honor the environment more. They learned to get through some of the religious differences that are so intense in India. And they reported that as you talk for a while with others, you tend to see yourself in others, and then it's easier to treat others as yourself. I looked at Italy. Italy has 3 large cooperative alliances that Mussolini gutted during World War II because they were a threat, but they revived after the war. And one of the alliances is aligned with the Christian Democrats that wants to create a more humane form of capitalism. One of the alliances works with the Catholic Church to create a liberation theology and a more participatory democracy within the church. And there's a social democratic alliance that believes in democratic socialism and sees workers working in their cooperatives as being able to take over factories and utilities, and they could do it democratically. So all 3 streams are there. And in northern Italy, it's over half the economy is cooperatives. So we see a lot of success with this in Europe. Now, We have a rich history in the United States with cooperatives. The Knights of Labor and the populist movement fought the robber barons and created thousands of cooperatives, food, farm, factory, credit cooperatives in the United States. And this was pushed aside toward the 1920s, but reemerged after the Depression, and the government stepped in with rural electrical cooperatives because businesses didn't want to set up the cooperatives there because it didn't make money for them. So those cooperatives were set up, and it gave rural electricity to millions of Americans. This revived in the 1960s, and we have thousands of cooperatives in the United States today, from Land O'Lakes Dairy to King Arthur Flour to Ace Hardware and thousands of credit cooperatives. We're just now starting to understand how widespread this was within the African American community. Because of Jessica Gordon Nemhard's work, we're able to see that while white banks and governments didn't help much until the 1970s, there was a cohesion in the black community to have mutual aid societies and cooperatives. And to give you an idea, in the 1930s in North Carolina, 98 credit unions were set up, and it was dangerous to do the community organizing. Every major black leader has spoken about the central place for cooperatives, from Frederick Douglass to W.B. Du Bois to Ella Baker to Martin Luther King. They have all written and talked about it. And the fourth pillar of Kwanzaa is economic cooperation. Well, if we look at Europe today, the most popular business to work for in Holland is Buurtzorg. It's a home health care company where they've got 12,000 employees, 11,000 are nurses, and they divide the nurses into teams of 12 and let them make all the decisions. So everything from hiring to benefits to quality of work to troubleshooting, all of it is run with those teams democratically without leaders. Now they train those teams in active listening and conflict resolution and peer-to-peer counseling, and it's a great success. For the last 5 years, that's been the best place to work in Holland. Workplace democracy, the studies show, those businesses stay stable longer than traditional businesses. When there's a recession or a pandemic, no one gets laid off. The money gets reinvested in the community. Workers report better health, they're happier, they're more involved in their communities, they're more involved with their government, and they protect the earth. This is something globally. It's been talked about for a long time by the International Conference of Cooperatives, and they've been going for over 100 years, but we don't tend to hear too much about this. In this state, some of these ideas are adopted. Nucor Steel has the workers on the shop floor make all the decisions, and they're thriving. And finally, the Harvard Business Review is writing about this material, but you don't hear much of it in the mass media. And it's a corporate-owned mass media that won't talk much about minimum wage on Labor Day, let alone workplace democracy. In academia, the fields of economics and political science marginalize these movements. And part of the problem is the terms themselves. You have workplace democracy and cooperatives, which I've interchanged today, but also it could refer to democratic capitalism, democratic socialism, social enterprises, solidarity economy, and then the Europeans have different terms for it, libertarianism, anarchism, and the Eastern Europeans call them worker councils, and that the old Russian term for that 100 years ago was Soviets. They talk about breathtaking betrayal. Well, speaking of words, the ancient Greeks had a word along the line of democracy that's interesting called isonomia, to neither rule nor be ruled. They also had a term for those who think about themselves and not the common good, idiots. Now, since corporations are legal people, you wonder what the Greeks would say. Anthropologists now will teach that humans have evolved as a cooperative, egalitarian species as hunter-gatherers for 95% of our history. We needed to cooperate because other hominids like Neanderthals were bigger and had bigger brains, so cooperation was absolutely essential. The workplace democracy is where we learn democracy. That's where people get accustomed to conflict resolution, to listening closely, to compromising. This is a set of skills that I think has to be learned to be brought into society. And this is something that the public, once you teach, you're able to see how students, if there were democracy in a classroom, would be able to bring those skills other places, but lacking it in the family or church, the workplace is a way for bringing more democracy into society. And you know, workplace democracy supports the conservative ideas of freedom, free enterprise, and limited government. The liberal ideas of diversity, dignity, opportunity, and sustainability, and the radical ideas of egalitarianism and global citizenship. It seems easier to treat your neighbor as yourself if your fates are tied at work and your daily bread is tied to her daily bread. This just may be the common sense of the day, and I submit let's keep the faith with democracy. Thank you.